Nobody bid on the burned alien bride at the auction, and a lone human farmer raised his hand. The auction yard at Junction Bend on Farron's Hollow smelled of horse sweat and crushed straw, and the kind of cold dust the wind picks up off a frontier plowland in late autumn when the harvest is in and the planet is preparing to sleep. Ellis Drake had come into town that morning for a draft animal. His old kestric, a six-legged, gray-coated work beast that had pulled his plow for 9 seasons, had thrown a foreleg the week before and was now buried in the long pasture under a stone he had set himself. He needed another. He had brought with him 340 salt credits, which was nearly all the salt credits he had after the harvest tax, and a small folded list of beasts and prices in his shirt pocket, written out by his neighbor Mose, who knew the auction circuits better than he did. He was 39 years old. He was black, born on a ranch colony moon in the Marador system, raised by a working father who had taught him to sit a saddle before he was 4 and to read prices on a stockman's chalkboard before he was 7. He had moved to Farron's Hollow at 26, when the Junction Bend land grants were open to homesteaders, and he had been farming his quarter section above the slow river ever since. He was a tall man, 6'2", with the long frame of a man who had grown up doing work. His hair was cut short, kept neat. His beard was kept neat too, salted at the chin with the first real gray of his life. His eyes were a steady, warm brown, set deep, slow to anger and slow to leave a thing once they had settled on it. He wore a faded denim work coat over a buff cotton shirt and dark canvas trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat the color of wet earth, and a pair of sturdy brown work boots that had been resoled twice. His left hand wore the gold ring his wife Tamsin had put on it 9 years ago. He had not taken the ring off in the 3 years and 4 months since he had buried Tamsin and their 9-year-old son Jonah in the same week of a respiratory plague that had moved through the lower river enclaves like a long, quiet tide. The auction was held in the open yard behind the Junction Bend exchange, under a long timber awning with a chalkboard hung from the front beam. Ellis stood at the back along the wooden rail with his hat held in his hand and his salt credits in the inner pocket of his coat. The crowd was the usual crowd. Farmers and ranch hands from the upper river, a few Voth livestock dealers from the off-world trade post, 3 or 4 Brennery mechanics in their working leathers, a small group of Junction Bend townsfolk who came to watch even when they were not buying. The bell rang at the 2nd hour past noon, and the auctioneer, a long-faced human named Mavis Pell, stepped up to the platform with her chalk and her ledger and began the lots. Ellis watched the kestrics go. He bid carefully on the 3rd one, a 5-year-old roan mare with good hooves and a calm temperament, and won her at 210 salt credits, which left him a margin he had not expected. He paid the auction clerk and tied the mare to the rail outside the exchange, and came back to watch the rest of the lots, because the rest of the lots included 3 more draft beasts he was curious about for next season's planning. He did not, when he came back, expect the lot that came up after the kestrics. The chalkboard changed. Mavis Pell, who had been auctioneer at Junction Bend for 21 years and who had a reputation for keeping her ledger tight and her commentary clean, hesitated at the lot card in her hand. She looked at it. She looked at the back of the platform. She set the card on the chalk rail and cleared her throat. She said, in the steady, neutral voice of a woman who had decided long ago that she would carry the lot her ledger told her to carry, without putting her own opinion on it. Lot 18, indenture transfer, female alien, bonded debt of the late Ostrak-Renvega family of Severin 4. Listed condition burned, listed value to be set by the floor. The crowd went a small step quieter. Ellis Drake, who had not seen this kind of lot at Junction Bend before, who had not, in fact, known that this kind of lot was a thing that happened at Junction Bend, leaned forward against the wooden rail and watched a Voth handler walk her up onto the platform from the back. She was small, slim, no more than 5 feet tall in the boots they had given her, and she walked with the stiff, careful gait of a person who had been on her feet too long without water. Her skin, where it was visible, was the soft coral pink of a sunset on a temperate planet, with old burn scars across the entire left side of her face and the left side of her neck and what Ellis could see of her left arm. The burn scars were old enough to have settled into the slow silver pink of healed tissue. But they had healed wrong. The skin pulled tight at the corner of her left eye and along her jaw. She wore a long, ash-stained robe of pale, gray wool, worn at the cuffs, that covered her body fully and modestly to the wrists and ankles. A makeshift veil of thin gray gauze had been pinned across the left side of her face by some kindness somewhere along her road. Her hair, where it was visible past the veil, was singed short along the burned side and long, the soft, pale rose of dawn light on the unburned side. She had 2 eyes. The left was milky white, blinded in the same fire that had taken her face. The right was a bright, clear copper, set steady in the unburned side of her face. And it looked out across the auction yard with the calm patience of a person who had learned, in the long 4 years since whatever fire had visited her, not to expect a man who turned around to be a man who would help. The auctioneer adjusted her chalk. She said, "Opening floor at 100 salt." The crowd did not move. A Voth livestock dealer at the side made a small dismissive sound through his lower mandible and turned to the man beside him. A pair of farmers near the front shook their heads quietly. The auctioneer waited. She said 90. The crowd did not move. A Junction Bend townsman near the back, a long, red-faced man whom Ellis recognized as Harvey Pell, a cousin of the auctioneer by their shared surname, but not by Ellis's knowledge, a man who shared her professional discipline, laughed a single short laugh and said loud enough to carry, "You couldn't pay me to take that home, Mavis." Several voices in the crowd murmured agreement. Mavis Pell did not look at her cousin. She looked at the lot card. She said, 80. The crowd did not move. The Voth livestock dealer was already turning away. The auctioneer cleared her throat. She said 70. She said 60. She said 50. The auction yard was quiet in the way an auction yard is quiet when a thing has fallen below the cost of moving it. Mavis Pell had to close the lot at no sale or move it down to the indenture transfer floor of 40, after which the bonded debt of the Ostrak-Renvega family would be charged to the Junction Bend exchange itself, who would carry the lot at a loss on their books. Ellis Drake saw all of this play out on the auctioneer's face in the small, precise way she handled the chalk. Mavis Pell was a careful woman. She did not enjoy this lot. She would rather it be gone. Ellis Drake, who had not that morning intended to do anything other than buy a draft animal for his fields and ride home in time to mend the south fence before dark, looked up at the small Salari woman on the platform. He looked at her one good copper eye. The copper eye looked back at him. It did not search his face. It did not plead. It rested on him with the same calm patience it had been resting on the rest of the auction yard. He thought, very simply, of his own wife Tamsin in the 2nd hour of the respiratory plague, sitting in her kitchen chair while he rubbed her back, looking out the window at the long pasture without expecting anything of him. And he thought, with the same simplicity, that he had not been able to save Tamsin, and he had not been able to save Jonah, and there was no salvation he could offer this woman either. But there was a roof on his farm, and a spare bedroom that had been Jonah's. and a slow river that ran past the south fence, and a long pasture that did not care who walked it. He raised his hand. He said, in the steady, warm voice he had used to settle horses for 35 years, 50. The auction yard turned. Harvey Pell laughed again, longer. The Voth livestock dealer made another small mandible click and turned away. Mavis Pell, who knew Ellis Drake well enough to know what kind of man raised his hand for a thing, looked at him for a held second and inclined her head a small fraction. She said, 50 going once? She said, 50 going twice. She said, sold to Drake of the Upper Ridge. She brought down the chalk gavel. Ellis paid the clerk. He took the indentured transfer chit and folded it into the inner pocket of his coat. He took the Voth handler aside at the back of the platform and said quietly, I will need her papers. The Voth produced a thin alloy ident band in a clouded plastic sleeve and pressed it into Ellis's palm without comment. Ellis read the band. The band gave her listed name as Thessa. No surname. Species Cellari. Age 24. Point of origin, Severin 4 Lower Agricultural Belt. The band gave the listed cause of indenture as the bankruptcy of the Ostrak-Ren-Vega family, who had taken her in as a refugee 5 years ago, and had then, before their bankruptcy, sold her bonded debt to a third-party collector to clear other obligations. Ellis read the band twice. He folded it back into the sleeve. He put the sleeve in the inner pocket of his coat beside the indenture chit. He walked over to the back of the platform where Thessa was standing under the eyes of the Voth handler. He stopped 2 paces from her. He took his hat off. He held it in front of his belt. He said in the same warm, steady voice, My name is Ellis Drake. I farm the upper ridge above the slow river. I have a roof, a spare bedroom, and a slow autumn ahead of us. Will you come home with me? The copper eye held his. He waited. Some people do not understand that a question requires a wait. He had been Tamsin's husband for 9 years. He understood. After 8 seconds, Thessa nodded once. The veil moved with her chin. She said, in a careful, soft voice the gauze did not muffle, I will come, Ellis Drake. He thanked the Voth handler. He led Thessa around the side of the auction yard to the rail where his roan mare was tied. The Junction Bend townspeople watched them walk past in the way townspeople watch a thing they intend to talk about for the next several weeks. Harvey Pell stood near the exchange door with 2 men Ellis half recognized, and he said something low to them as Ellis passed. And Ellis did not turn his head. He had learned long ago that the things townspeople said about a man were always going to be said, and a man who turned his head invited more of it. And a man who kept walking dictated the terms. He helped Thessa up onto the wagon bench. He untied the mare and checked her tack and climbed up beside Thessa and clicked the mare into a slow walk down the broad, packed dirt road that led north out of Junction Bend toward the river. The mare stepped out willingly. Thessa sat very still on the bench beside him, with her chain-banded wrist held carefully in her lap, and her one good copper eye on the road ahead. He did not press her. He had thought, on the platform, that there might be small things he should say to her on the wagon ride, small things to make the strangeness less strange. He decided, when he saw the way she sat, that he would not say them. He drove the wagon at the pace the mare wanted, which was slow. The road north out of Junction Bend climbed gently along a low ridge that ran parallel to the slow river, and the autumn light came down over the river in long, warm gold sheets, and the air smelled of cut grain and wet stone. The wagon's old leaf springs creaked once over a culvert, twice over a frost heave. The mare's hooves made the soft dust clop of late autumn dirt. Thessa watched the road. After a long minute, the copper eye flicked to Ellis, then back to the road, then back to him, too, she said very quietly. You did not bargain? He shook his head. He said no. He said 50 was the price the lot card said. He said 50 was the price I paid. She said, you did not have to pay anything. She said the lot was about to fall to the floor. He said, I know. She said, then why? He thought about it. He said, because the platform is a cold place to stand. He said, because I had a wagon and a roof and you did not. He said, because the kestric I bought today is going to need a calmer hand on her tack than mine. And you sit a wagon like a person who has sat one before. The copper eye held him for a longer beat. The veil shifted. He thought, but could not be sure, that she had smiled under it. After another long minute, she said, I have sat a wagon. He said, I thought so. They drove the rest of the way to the upper ridge in a quiet that was not heavy. The first stars came out over the river before they reached the gate of his farm. The farm sat on a low ridge above the slow river. The house was a 2-story timber frame with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that had been there longer than the colony grants. Behind the house ran a long rectangle of pasture and a smaller rectangle of plowland, fenced in split rail. And beyond that, the gentle bowl of the south fields where the harvest had been brought in 2 weeks before. There was a barn, freshly whitewashed last summer, and a small hen house, and a low storage shed with a rust-streaked tin roof. There was a single old apple tree in the front yard that had been a sapling when Tamsin and Ellis had bought the place. There was a lantern in the kitchen window that Ellis kept lit when he was away because Tamsin had hated coming home to a dark house, and he had not stopped lighting it. He drove the wagon up to the porch. He set the brake. He helped Thessa down. He led the roan mare around to the barn and unbuckled her tack and rubbed her down and gave her a half measure of grain and fresh water before he came back to the porch. Thessa was standing where he had left her, the same careful patience in her shoulders, the wagon ride dust soft on the hem of her robe. He said, "Come in, Thessa." He opened the front door. He held it for her. She went in. He came in behind her and lit the kitchen lamp. He showed her, in the slow, careful way you show a person around a house when you are aware of being one of two people, now in a place that has been one person's place for a long time. The kitchen, the front room, the washroom with the pump, the back porch, the upstairs landing. He showed her the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. The bedroom had a narrow bed under a quilt that Tamsin had pieced 6 summers ago. There was a small dresser with 3 drawers. There was a round braided rug that had been Jonah's favorite. There was a window that looked out over the south fields. The bedroom had been Jonah's. Ellis had not slept in it since the plague. He had not, in fact, opened the door more than 3 times in the years since. He had this morning, before he left for the auction, opened it for the first long airing in a season, and pulled clean linens onto the bed because he had a feeling he could not have named. Then, that he might need a clean spare bed by nightfall. Thessa stepped into the room and stood in the middle of it. She looked at the quilt. She looked at the round rug. She looked at the window. She did not ask whose room it had been. She said, in the same soft voice, "This is too much." He said, "No." He said, "This is what was here." He said, "Sleep tonight. We will figure the rest out tomorrow." She nodded once. He went downstairs and made a simple supper, biscuit and stewed root and a pot of grain tea, and brought a tray to the bottom of the stairs and set it on the small table there with the teacup turned right side up. He called up the stairs that supper was on the table whenever she wanted it. He went out on the back porch and sat in his chair and watched the stars come up over the south fields, and he did not, for a long, quiet stretch, think about anything at all. She did not speak for the first week. She slept 14 hours the first night, and she ate the biscuit and the stewed root in the small, careful way of a person who had learned in some past life that food might be taken away halfway through. He left simple meals at the bottom of the stairs in the morning and at noon and at evening, and he did not climb the stairs uninvited. On the third morning, he came in from the barn to find that the kitchen had been swept, the breakfast plates washed and stacked neatly beside the pump, and a folded clean cloth sat on the table. He did not comment. He did chores. The fourth morning the same. The fifth morning, he found her in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, in a clean gray homespun shift she had found in Tamsin's old chest at the foot of the spare bed. He had told her on the first night that the chest was hers if she wanted to use it. Making a pot of grain tea. The veil was still pinned across the left side of her face, the gauze fresh. The copper eye looked at him over the steam of the kettle. She said, "Will you take tea with me?" He said gladly. They drank tea at the kitchen table without saying much. The kettle whistled twice. The tea was good. Outside the kitchen window, the autumn light came in slow gold through the bare apple branches. Ellis Drake, who had not had tea with another adult human or otherwise in his kitchen in 3 years and 4 months, sat very still and let the warmth of the cup pass into his hands, and did not look at the tea leaves in the bottom of his cup or at the woman across the table. He looked at the window. By the second week, she was working in the kitchen garden behind the hen house. By the third week, she was helping in the barn with the new roan mare, brushing her down, checking the stitching on the saddle, doing the small, careful tack work that ranch hands learn when they grow up around horses. He saw her, on the fourth week, kneel by the herb bed beside the back porch and run her slim coral-pink fingers through the spent thyme and the dying basil, with the practiced certainty of a person who had been raised in some past life, with hands inside soil. She said, that night at supper, "Your basil has tip rot." He said, "I did not know basil could rot at the tip." She said, "It can." She said, "I can fix it." She said, "I will need 3 things from the upper pasture." She listed them in careful words. A kind of moss that grew on the north side of stone outcrops. A thin, reddish root that she described by leaf shape and by smell. A kind of yellow flower whose petals she folded once between her fingers when she described it. He went out the next morning before sunup and walked the upper pasture with her list in his head. He came back in 2 hours with all 3 things in a clean cotton sack. She made a salve in the kitchen that night. She rubbed it carefully into the soil around the basil. The basil straightened in 3 days. Ellis watched it straighten. He did not, that whole week, mention the salve out loud. He thought, in the small, private way a working man thinks about work, that he had been farming the upper ridge for 13 years, and his basil had had tip rot every autumn for 13 years. She told him, in pieces over the long, quiet weeks of the autumn rains, the slow architecture of her life. She had been born on Severin IV, in the lower agricultural belt of the southern continent, the youngest of 4. Her people, the Solari, were a small farming species native to that one belt, with a long-standing herbalist tradition that went back to before any of the human or Voth or Brenari or Yannick settlements had reached the planet. Her father had been a Solari herbalist, a quiet, careful man who had taught her every plant in the lower agricultural belt by leaf shape and by smell. Her mother had been a school teacher in the village school. She had had 2 older brothers and 1 older sister, all of whom had been working the family's small holding the day the Yannick militia raided the lower agricultural belt to clear it for a Yannick settlement charter. The firebombs had come at midday. The militia had not been particular. Her family had been killed. She had been pulled out of the burning house by a neighbor's son, who had also died of his burns 6 days later. She had been taken in by an Austrak-Renvega family who ran a refugee way station on the planet's eastern coast, and she had lived with them for 5 years, learning to walk again after the burns, learning to read the 47 characters of her own people's written script in private at night because the Austrak family had been kind in a tired way and would not have stopped her, but also would not have understood. She had learned the Austrak family's bookkeeping because they had needed help with bookkeeping, and she had run their refugee way station in everything but name in her last 2 years there. The bookkeeping had told her last spring that the Austrak family was going to fail. She had told them so. They had not believed her. They had failed 3 months later. They had sold her bonded debt to a third-party collector to clear other obligations because she had been the largest single asset on their books that did not have a body. She told Ellis all of this in the same calm, soft voice she used to ask him to take grain tea. She told it without crying. She said, when she was finished, your wife. The veil moved with her chin in the soft direction of his ring hand. She said, your wife is gone. He said, 3 years and 4 months. She said, I am sorry. He said, I am sorry too, about yours. They drank the grain tea in a long, shared quiet that did not need filling. She showed him the next day a thing she had been doing in the back of the spare bedroom at night. She had been drying small bundles of the autumn herbs from the kitchen garden by hanging them upside down from a thin cord she had strung between 2 nails she had pulled from the loose siding of the dormer window. She had been making a kind of mixture in a small clay bowl. She offered him a pinch of the mixture and asked him to put it in his evening grain tea. He did. The grain tea, which had been thin and slightly bitter for years because the local grain was always thin and slightly bitter, became an entire other thing. It became warm. It became layered. It became, to him, on his back porch on the 3rd week of the autumn rains, the closest thing to the tea Tamsin had used to make with the Brenari root spice she had bought once a year at the Marador festival before the plague had taken Brenari root spice away from his life, along with everything else. He sat with the cup in his hands for a long minute and looked out at the south fields. Thessa stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him. He said, finally, this is good. She said, I know. The veil moved. He understood, even in the dim porch light, that she was smiling under it. Junction Bend talked about him for the 1st month, and then the 2nd, and then the talk slowed the way talk slows in a small town when there is a new harvest cycle to argue about. The kestric mare worked out as he had hoped. Thessa worked out better. He paid the indenture transfer chit at the exchange in 2 installments and tore the 2nd copy of it up on the front porch the day he made the final payment, because the exchange did not need a 2nd copy of a chit that was no longer his. He told Thessa, on the porch that night, that as far as the law of Ferran's Hollow was concerned, she was no longer indentured to him or to anyone, and she was free to leave whenever she chose, with anything she wanted from the house and with the kestric mare if she wanted her, and he would drive her into Junction Bend at any hour of any day or night she asked. The veil moved. The copper eye held him. After a long second she said, very soft, I am not leaving, Ellis Drake. He said, I know. He said, I just wanted you to hear it from me. She said, I heard it. They sat on the porch, went and watched the first frost come down on the south fields in the dark. Harvey Pell came up the road in the second week of the first hard frost. He came at the third hour past sunset, with two men Ellis half recognized from town, all three of them on horseback, with the soft warmth of station-still cantina spirits in them. They came up the road with the sort of casual loud purpose that men with cantina spirits in them mistake for righteousness. Ellis heard them before he saw them. He had been at the kitchen table fitting a new leather strap onto an old halter for the kestric. He set the halter down. He told Thessa, who was at the basin washing the supper dishes, to go upstairs. She went upstairs. He took the long rifle off the rack above the front door and checked the load and stepped out onto the porch. Harvey Pell pulled up at the gate. He hailed Ellis with the loud, false friendliness Ellis had been hearing in town for 3 months. He said, "Ellis Drake, we want a word." Ellis said, "From the porch." "You've come a long way for a word." Pell said, "We want to look at the alien." Ellis said, "No." Pell said, "We just want to look at her." The men with him laughed a low laugh. Ellis said, "Get off my road." Pell said, "Drake, this is a Junction Bend matter." Ellis said, "This is my land, this is my road, and you are leaving." He brought the long rifle level. He did not point it at Pell. He pointed it at the dirt 3 feet to the left of Pell's horse, which was the warning a man gave another man on a frontier road in the year of his life, when the man hoped not to need a second warning. Pell, who had cantina spirits in him and a cousin's auctioneer ledger he half-blamed Ellis for, swung off his horse. He came up the road on foot in the loud, loose way drunks come up roads on foot. He came up to the gate. He put his hand on the gate latch. He said, "I will look at her." Ellis came down off the porch, 3 steps, and he put the long rifle level at Pell's chest. And he said, in the warm, steady voice he used to settle horses, "Harvey, you take your hand off that latch, and you go home." The 2 men with Pell on the road went very still in their saddles. Pell laughed. Pell said, "Drake, you would not." Ellis did not answer. Ellis did not need to answer. Ellis stood on the porch path with the long rifle level and his right hand on the trigger guard and his left hand on the forward stock, the way his father had taught him to hold a long rifle when a thing was going to go one way or the other, and a man's posture was going to decide which. Pell took his hand off the latch. Pell looked at the rifle. Pell looked at Ellis's face. Pell looked at the rifle again. Pell, in the small private way drunks understand things they will not admit until morning, understood that Ellis Drake was a man who would not, in fact, fire on him for a hand on a gate latch, but who would, with great certainty, fire on him for a step inside the gate. Pell took 2 steps back. Pell got back on his horse. Pell said, "This is not over, Drake." Pell turned his horse and rode back down the road with the 2 men with him. Ellis stood on the porch path until the sound of the hooves had gone past the second bend of the road. Then he went back up to the porch. He sat in his chair. He set the long rifle across his knees. He did not, for a long stretch, breathe properly. Thessa came down the stairs. She came out onto the porch in her stocking feet. She had taken off the veil. The whole left side of her face, the long old burn scars, the tightened skin at the corner of the milky white eye, was visible in the lamplight. She did not put the veil back on. She came over to his chair and stood beside it. She said in a voice that had a small thread of steel in it that he had not yet heard, "Ellis Drake, you are not standing alone on this porch." He looked up at her. He looked at her face. He said, "I know." He said, "I haven't stood alone on this porch since the auction yard." She put her hand on his shoulder. He covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a long time. The first frost came down in the south fields in the dark. The night went very quiet. Mose came up the road at first light. Mose was Ellis's nearest neighbor, a short, broad-shouldered Brenari farmer who had taken the next quarter section over 12 years ago and had been the first man on the upper ridge to pour Ellis a cup of coffee after Tamsin had been buried. Mose had heard, in the way small communities hear everything, that Harvey Pell had ridden up the road with 2 men the night before. Mose had brought a long rifle of his own. Mose had brought, also, a small clay jar of preserved blackberries from his wife's pantry, because in the upper ridge culture of his people, the appropriate response to a neighbor's hard night was a small jar of preserved blackberries. And Mose was a careful man about the rules of his people. Ellis met him at the gate. Ellis took the jar. Ellis said, "Thank you, Mose." Mose said, in the careful Brenari cadence, "You are not standing alone on this road, Ellis Drake." Ellis said, "I know." Mose looked at the porch. Mose said, "The alien woman." Ellis said, "Her name is Thessa." Mose said, "Thessa." Ellis said, "Yes." Mose nodded. Mose said, "We will keep the road quiet." Ellis said, "Thank you." Mose mounted his small wiry kestric and rode back down the road in the long gray hour before sunrise. Ellis took the jar of blackberries inside and set it on the kitchen table beside the kettle. Mavis Pell came up the road 3 days later. She came alone in her single-seat trap, with her chalk ledger satchel beside her. She did not get down at the gate. Ellis came down off the porch. They spoke at the gate. Mavis Pell said, "Drake," Ellis said. "Mavis." Mavis Pell said, "I have come to apologize for my cousin." Ellis said, "Your cousin came on his own ride." Mavis Pell said, "My cousin came riding the wind he caught from my auction yard, and the auction yard is mine, and I owe you the apology." Ellis looked at her for a held second. He said, "Accepted." Mavis Pell nodded once, the careful nod of an auctioneer closing a transaction. She said, "The indentured transfer lots will not run on my chalkboard again." Ellis said, "That is your decision." She said, "It is." She said, "Harvey will not come up this road again." Ellis said, "That is also your decision." She said, "It is." She said, "Drake, your wife." Mavis Pell looked at the apple tree in the front yard. She said, "Tamsin was a friend of mine, and I have not said so often enough since she went." Ellis felt his throat tighten. He said, "Thank you, Mavis." Mavis Pell turned the trap and drove back down the road in the warm, late morning sun. Ellis watched her go until the dust had settled. He went back up to the porch. Thessa was standing in the doorway with a basket of dried autumn herbs in her hand. He told her, the short version, who Mavis was and what she had said. Thessa listened. Thessa said, "The auctioneer is a friend." Ellis said, "I had not known until today." Thessa said, "The auctioneer is a friend." He nodded. He said, "Yes." The winter came down hard on the upper ridge in the 8th week after the auction. The slow river froze along its edges. The south fields went under 3 inches of fine, dry snow that did not melt for 40 days. Ellis split firewood through the cold mornings, working his shoulder back into the rhythm of the axe after a long, lazy autumn. Thessa took over the kitchen completely. She made stews and breads and a careful series of Solari herb teas that Ellis came to drink the way a man drinks a thing he has come to need without admitting he needs it. She fixed, in the long, quiet hours of the snow weeks, the loose siding on the dormer window, the cracked hinge on the kitchen pantry, the small leak in the washroom ceiling that Ellis had been meaning to climb up and look at since before Tamsin died. She was not, Ellis discovered, only an herbalist. She was a person with hands She had been raised by a Solari herbalist father in the lower agricultural belt of Sevren 4, and her father had taught her how the world was put together, and she had not forgotten any of it. On the first warm day of the false thaw in the 9th week, she came out of the spare bedroom with her arms full of folded linens. She walked past Ellis at the kitchen table without comment. She went into the front bedroom, the upstairs front bedroom, the one Ellis had shared with Tamsin, the one he had been sleeping in alone for 3 years and 4 months. He stood up at the kitchen table. He went to the bottom of the stairs. He did not climb them. After a long, quiet minute, Tessa came back down. She had her own folded gray homespun shifts in her arms now, and the round braided rug from the spare bedroom under one elbow. She did not look at him. She said, in the soft, careful voice that had been his daily companion all autumn, "The spare bedroom should be Mira's room, when we have a Mira." She said, "The front bedroom should be ours." He did not say anything for a while. He looked at her face. The veil had been gone by then, for 3 weeks. The whole left side of her face was a thing he had stopped noticing the same way he had stopped noticing his own scars. He nodded. He said, "All right." He said, "Please." She said, "I will move my things tonight." He said, "All right." He climbed the stairs ahead of her and opened the front bedroom door and held it for her. She went in. He went in after her. He did not, that night, do anything other than pull the chair from the corner over to the window and sit beside her bed while she fell asleep, the way he had once sat beside Tamsin's bed in the 2nd hour of the plague. She was not dying. She was sleeping. He sat beside her until her breath settled. Then he climbed under the quilt on his own side of the bed for the first time in 3 years and 4 months. He lay there in the warm dark and listened to a woman breathing in his house. The wind came up off the slow river. The lantern in the kitchen window was lit. The snow on the south fields was old and quiet. He slept properly for the first time since he had buried Tamsin and Jonah in the same week. The Solari Council came in the spring. They came in a small, clean cutter, with the soft, pale gray lattice markings of a registered Solari diplomatic vessel. And they sat down in the Junction Bend exchange yard at mid-morning on a clear blue day, and walked up the road to the upper ridge in the formal walking pattern of a Solari delegation. 3 elders in pale gray robes and a single tall, thin-shouldered Solari mage healer in a deep blue mantle with a small silver caduceus pinned at her throat. They had come, the eldest of them said gently when Ellis met them at the gate, on the matter of a Solari woman of the Sevren 4 lower agricultural belt who had been reported by a Brennari freight courier as living, against the records of the Solari Council, on a homestead on Ferran's Hollow. Ellis took them into the front room. Tessa came down from the spare bedroom in a clean gray homespun dress and her veil pinned over the burned cheek. And she stopped at the foot of the stairs when she saw them, and she stayed there for a long second. And the eldest Solari elder, a woman with hair gone entirely the soft silver of a winter moon, made a small involuntary sound and bowed her head. Tessa came down the rest of the stairs. The elders rose and bowed. The Solari mage healer set down the small carved wooden case she was carrying. They drank tea at the kitchen table. The conversation, which Ellis followed in fragments because much of it was conducted in the soft, sibilant Solari language he did not speak, turned slowly on a single point. The council had, since the Yonic raids on the lower agricultural belt 8 years ago, been slowly gathering surviving Solari refugees from across the rim systems and reseeding them on a small protected sanctuary world called Lan Ostrak that had been negotiated for the species under a Brennari diplomatic charter. The sanctuary world was beautiful. It was warm. It had soil that wanted salari herbs, and a population now of nearly 4,000 surviving salari, working the slow rebuilding of their species' food culture and their species' memory. The mage healer in the blue mantle had brought, in the small carved wooden case, a salari restorative paste that could, applied over a 6-month course, repair a substantial portion of the cosmetic damage from old fire-burned scars, and could not restore the milky white eye, but could ease the pull of the tightened skin around it. The eldest elder said gently, "Thessa, daughter of Severin IV, you are welcomed by the council to come home with us." The mage healer said gently, "Your face is not a thing you have to keep." The middle elder said gently, "The sanctuary is warm, and the soil is good, and your people are there." Thessa listened to all of it. She held her grain teacup in her hands. She looked once at Ellis Drake, who was sitting in the second chair at the kitchen table with his hands folded carefully in his lap, and his eyes on the table grain, and his face very still in the way a man's face goes still when he has decided not to ask anything of the woman across from him. After a long minute, Thessa set her teacup down. She lifted her chin. She unpinned the veil. She set it on the table beside the cup. The whole left side of her face was visible in the warm spring light. The copper eye and the milky white eye both met the eldest elder's eyes evenly. Thessa said, in the formal cadence of Salari, that Ellis did not understand, but that he understood the weight of. The words she had been waiting 4 years to say. The eldest elder bowed her head slightly. The mage healer set down her own cup. The middle elder reached gently across the table and put one slim coral pink hand briefly on Thessa's coral pink wrist, and withdrew it. Thessa turned to Ellis. She switched into Common Galactic. She said, for him to hear in the language he could follow, "I am staying here, Ellis Drake." He looked up. She said, "I am not asking." She said, "I am telling you." She said, "If you will have me, this is my house." He said, in a voice that had to come up through something, "This is your house." She nodded. She picked the veil up off the table. She did not put it back on. She set it gently on the chair beside her. The mage healer, after a moment, opened the small carved wooden case and offered the Salari restorative paste to Thessa anyway. Thessa accepted it. The mage healer offered, in addition, a slim bronze marker with the Salari diplomatic sigil etched on its face, and she pressed it into Ellis's hand. She said in careful Common Galactic, "Your homestead is now under the protective marker of the Salari Council." She said, "No Junction Bend townsperson, no Yannick agent, no pay-in compact bounty hunter will harass this farm again, or they will answer to a Brenari diplomatic court." He looked at the marker in his palm. He thanked her. He put the marker on the mantel of the front room fireplace, where the lantern stood when it was lit. The Salari delegation drank their tea. They left in the late afternoon with formal bows and a small woven gift basket of Salari herb seeds that Thessa had asked them to bring for her kitchen garden. The cutter lifted off the Junction Bend exchange yard at sunset and turned for the rim. Ellis Drake and Thessa stood on the porch and watched it go. He had her hand. She had his. The first warm wind of true spring came up the slow river and crossed the south fields and reached the porch. They were married at the Junction Bend small chapel on the first long midsummer day of the next year. Mavis Pell was a witness. Mose from the next farm was a witness. 3 Salari elders came up from Lan Ostrak for the small ceremony and brought with them small bronze bonding marks that Thessa wore on a thin leather cord at her throat for the rest of her life. The Junction Bend townspeople did not all come. Enough of them came. Harvey Pell did not come. Harvey Pell had moved by then to a brother's place out at the rim of the Colony Grant, and the auction yard in town had quieted in a way the town quietly preferred not to discuss. Mavis Pell, who had carried the lot card on the day Ellis Drake had raised his hand, gave them a small carved wooden bowl as a wedding present. The bowl sat on the kitchen shelf above the pump for the rest of Ellis's life, where it held, depending on the season, eggs from the hen house or seed potatoes for the spring planting, or the small dried pinches of the autumn herbs Thessa kept ready for tea. The farm grew. Thessa's herbalism saved the upper ridge crop in the 3rd year of their marriage, when a fungal blight came up out of the slow river and started to take the local grain. And Thessa walked the fields for 9 days straight, with 3 Solari herb compounds and a small folding chair, treating row after row of the neighbors' crops along with their own. And the Junction Bend grain harvest that year was the largest the colony had recorded since the founding, and the next year and the year after that. The town came around the way towns come around when a thing has demonstrated itself. There were, by the 7th year, 3 other Solari families settled along the slow river under the protective marker of the council, who had heard, through the slow Solari grapevine, that there was a township on Ferran's Hollow that had been seeded by a homesteader and a Solari herbalist, where the soil was good and the diplomatic marker held. Ellis taught the new Solari farmers how to handle a kestric. Thessa taught the new Junction Bend daughters how to handle a basil bed. The lower river enclaves, which had lost their human population to the plague 3 years before Ellis bought his land, were quietly resettled by a mixed cooperative of Brennari mechanics, Solari farmers, and a few human families from the upper rim who had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for a township on Ferran's Hollow to be the kind of township it had now become. They had children. They took in 2 foundling Solari orphans from a Yannick Belt enclave 4 years into their marriage. Twin girls who had been pulled out of the same sort of fire that had taken Thessa's family. And they raised them in the spare bedroom that had been Jonah's, with the round braided rug Jonah had loved still on the floor between the 2 beds. They named the elder girl Mira and the younger girl Tamsin, the second name spoken once by Ellis in the kitchen on the night Thessa had asked him for it, and again by Thessa when she had repeated it to him with a small, soft certainty that had let him know she had thought about it for a long time. The girls grew. The girls married. The girls had their own children. The farm grew. The slow river kept being slow. The lantern in the kitchen window stayed lit on the nights Ellis went into Junction Bend, and dark on the nights he was home. Ellis Drake died in the late autumn of his 68th year, in his own bed, in the upstairs front bedroom of the house above the slow river, with Thessa beside him holding his hand, and his elder daughter Mira reading from the small Solari herbalist's book Thessa had taught her to read when she was small. The book was a book of plants and their seasons. It was a book about the slow, patient, careful work of a person tending a thing that wants to grow. It was a fitting book to die to. Thessa stayed on the farm for 19 more years. She ran the kitchen garden and the herb bed. She raised 8 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren on the long porch. The lantern in the kitchen windows stayed lit on the nights any of her people were out. She died in her own bed in the upstairs front bedroom of the same house in the spring of her 91st year by the Solari count, with Mira and Tamsin both holding her hands. The bronze bonding marks Ellis had set on her throat at the chapel 63 years before were still on the leather cord around her neck. The auction yard at Junction Bend stopped running indenture transfer lots in the year after Ellis Drake had raised his hand. Mavis Pell saw to that quietly, by changing what her ledger would and would not carry. The story of the lot, the chalk gavel, The long ride up the upper ridge in the autumn light became one of the small stories the upper river told about itself, the way small towns tell themselves the kinds of stories they want to be true. It was, in fact, true. The chalk gavel was kept eventually in a small glass case at the front of the Junction Bend exchange with a brass plate that said only 50 going once, 50 going twice. There was no name on the brass plate. There did not need to be. The town knew. The river knew. The upper ridge knew. The slow, careful work of a man who had raised his hand for a thing nobody else had wanted. And the slow, careful work of a woman who had not, at 50 salt credits, expected a man who turned around to be a man who would help, had become, by the long, quiet method of small towns and slow rivers, the way the place understood itself. He had not been a hero. He had only raised his hand. The galaxy had remembered him longer than he had remembered himself. Sometimes a hand offered was the whole answer. Sometimes a chalk gavel coming down at 50 going twice was the whole answer. The chain was gone. The veil was gone. The auction yard had stopped running the lot. The kitchen lantern was lit. 2 grown daughters were in the herb bed at the side of the house. The slow river ran along the south fence the way slow rivers run, which is to say, the way they always have. He had been enough. That had been enough. That had, in the end, been everything.